All right, first of all, let me apologize for looking awful. I am sick and running a fever, but we're going to get through this PowerPoint, so I apologize again. Um, we're looking at your chapter kind of leading up to the Holocaust. And in particular, we're going to be looking at two eugenics issues that really changed socially America and whose, to be honest with you, whose effects we're still feeling today. And that's immigration and marriage. Let me see if I can get this to advance. All right, so we'll start first with something that we don't often think about with eugenics movement, and that is birth control. When in fact, that is a major component of the eugenics movement in the early years. Margaret Sanger was a very ardent a eugenicist, and she really believed that birth control would help control the population. She also believed in Malthusian's theory that there was only so much food and other supplies available to people, and that eventually we would run out. So she felt birth control would enable us to make sure the proper people became continued to populate the world. And that she viewed poor people particularly as leeches on society. And in fact, she was against a lot of the charities out there because she felt that was kind of like feeding stray cats. Even though Margaret Sanger has kind of a folk hero like reverence among many in the feminist movements, she really wasn't all that kind of a person. I mean, she was careful to take care of people, but she felt disgusted by the way people in poverty lived, and she felt that they were just kind of breeding, and that we'd be much better off controlling birth, family planning, and ensuring that the next generation was of a better sort of people, type of people. She also felt that immigrants were wrong to be brought into the United States because there was too many feeble-minded among them. All right. So birth control itself, again, she heavily promoted this idea of birth control as a way to limit the amount of children you have, and thereby fit in with that idea that you only had so much supplies and you had to watch out for that demand. And she said herself, I'm going to read her quote, birth control, which has been criticized as negative and destructive, is really the greatest and most truly eugenic method, and its adoption as part of the program of eugenics would immediately give a concrete and realistic power to that science. As a matter of fact, birth control has been accepted by the most clear-thinking and far-seeing eugenicists themselves as the most constructive and necessary to the means to racial health. Now, the eugenicists didn't actually believe this. And in fact, they never completely went into Sanger's ideas. And there was always a separation between the eugenics movement and what Sanger believed. Part of that was probably because she was a woman. And part of it was that birth control gave women a lot of power. And there were people that just didn't want that. And that was part of Sanger's aim, was birth control gave women more power. One of the other social issues that was a result of the eugenics movement was marriage loss. And while they aim in the realm of heredity, with the idea that you can kind of inherit certain qualities. And in fact, a doctor, Lucian Howe, really began promoting the idea that people who were blind with hereditary blindness should not be allowed to marry. And there were also some pushing for the end of marriages between people with hereditary deafness, or even between non-deaf and people with hereditary deafness, people who are feeble-minded. And we suddenly started to have marriage laws. Before the eugenics movement hit in the early 1900s, there were no marriage laws in most states, with the exception of maybe racial ones. And even that, it depended on the state. There were certainly very few, if any, marriage laws. Marriages were kind of like two people got together, found a pastor or a priest, and they got married. And that was pretty much it. But suddenly there was this movement, and eugenicists saw marriage laws as a way of halting the procreation between defectives. Because, people never have children outside of marriage, right? But many states began ushering in these laws, and we're going to see about a man named Plecker, who really promoted these kind of racial-based laws in Virginia that survived until the 1970s. Other states also had marriage laws, and they involved things from various factors. Many states had age and related marriage laws. You can't marry someone under a certain age, for example. Though some states still do not have those laws. I believe Arkansas doesn't have it. Kinship, you can't marry your sister or brother. You can't marry your first cousin in many states. You can't marry your uncle or aunt. So that was part of it as well. And then, race, there was a lot of race-based laws. Montana outlawed between whites and persons of Japanese and Chinese descent. Many states had outlaw between whites and blacks, with Virginia being the most ardent about it, where they even said nothing between white and one drop of one non-white blood. Then there were states that were forbidding between whites and Malays, whites and Native Americans. So there was a lot. And we also started to see different medical issues, insanity, epilepsy. If you were epileptic, in many states you couldn't get married. Feeble-mindedness, again, that very vague term. And syphilis. And Delaware even criminalized marriage between two poor people. So that's an interesting way of getting that to work. So as we see, the next social issue that starts to come in is immigration. These are some pictures I thought were interesting of Ellis Island immigrants. One of the things with immigrants is many of them were poor, obviously. Many of them were refugees running from poverty, famine, governments that were after them. But they also dressed in many of their native outfits, and they looked kind of shabby. So that really brought in this idea that they were feeble-minded. But there was also just an intense number of them. I mean, we're freaking out in America right now about maybe 100,000 South Americans coming. Between 1890 and 1914, which is only a little under 25 years, America had nearly 15 million immigrants come through Ellis Island. Oh, sorry about that. Hold on. So this was the amount of refugees coming in from Europe was just overwhelming. And many of them were coming again from famine. The Irish were escaping a horrible potato famine. Others were escaping racial divisions and anti-Semitism, but most of them were just uneducated and poverty-stricken living in countries that just couldn't afford to take care of them right, and had no social structure. But America offered a chance of opportunity. But it also began seeing a fear of what could happen if America's racial division changed that much. Um, and I think you can understand how that can be problematic in America. We fear change, and that many immigrants would change the way Americans looked, the way our social structure was. So we began to try to find ways of blocking some. Some were blocked from tests on IQ. Some were blocked for medical reasons. There wasn't really an opportunity to block for make my little thing just a little bit smaller here. Sorry, moving my picture. But this was again major problems, and changing the entire social structure of America certainly can be problematic. Um, and this led to this fear of mongrelization. Mongrelization is basically the mixing of races. So many early eugenics wanted to codify this into American law through the Census Department. But the Census Department, to their credit, never gave in. They would not allow, for example, listing of the parents' racial identities of people. But again, Plecker was the guy that tried to push this through the most. Um, he even set up a law in Virginia, which, when he wasn't permitted by the Census Bureau, he went after doctors and midwives and made them sign a document that could put them in prison if they falsified the information, stating what race the parents of the child were, because he had gotten Virginia to accept this one drop law, which claimed if one drop of non-white blood appeared, then the child was not white. There was an exception to that rule. The exception was if your relative was Pocahontas. The reason being, many of the Virginian wealthy class claimed to be related to Pocahontas, so they got exempted. However, the lasting effect of this did stretch beyond Virginia, and it went into the Nuremberg Council, who used Plecker's ideas to set up some of their uh, Nuremberg rules, though in a more complicated system. And here's a copy of her Virginia birth certificate, just so you can kind of see a little bit. And you can see here, it talks about the blood.
Are you okay?
So some of our conclusions. One of the conclusions is that eugenics allowed for this race-based policy to flourish. And this was a policy ripe at the time, as we see this change in American social structure. We see these large swaths of immigrants. Again, you cannot imagine the difference between the immigration issue back then and the immigration we see now in terms of the amount of immigrants. We see the end of slavery and the Great Migration starting, where blacks were moving north and going to areas where they had never been before. And that created its own sense of fear. So there was this sense of identity issues. There was this fear that the next generation would not be as well off as the previous one, which led to many of these issues involving heredity. and the fear of feeble-mindedness, which seemed to be a diagnosis coming out of nowhere. Granted, it's one of those things: is it the chicken or the egg? Is feeble-mindedness getting more of a diagnosis because it now has a diagnosis? Or were there always that many feeble-minded? So that, along with the fact that something we haven't talked really about, which is that the rich were getting richer while the poor were getting poorer. So economic um, differences was increasing. So all of those were leading up to the outcomes that the Nuremberg Council starts. And we'll be talking more about that next week with the introduction of the Holocaust.